We're going to be talking about Camille Paglia and her philosophy this evening. She's still alive. She's one of these crazy gay academics, but unlike the majority of American feminist thinkers, for example, Judith Butler, who have quite a dry approach to their work and thinking about sex. Camille Paglia is intense. She loves lust. She loves eroticism. She loves Madonna. She loves masculinity. So we're going to dive into it all this evening. What's going on here? So the first up, to get the background of where she's working, she is building on the tradition of Nietzsche and Freud in her work. And Nietzsche in particular devotes a lot of time to analyzing these two gods, Apollo and Dionysus, who he thinks are kind of at the core, certainly, of the classical sensibility of thinking about art, about philosophy, about culture. And Paglia basically says they haven't gone away. They've been with us the entire time. Some of you guys might have come across this before, but the basic idea is that Apollo, who we've got on the right-hand side, he's the god of order, of poetry, of rationality, of individuation, of beauty, of culture. And on the left-hand side, you've got Dionysus, who is this god of drinking, of sensuality, of music, of energy, of intensity, of madness. And the two gods in Nietzsche's thought are constantly in conversation throughout the ancient world. And in a sense, there's a necessity for both to be present. Here's another depiction of the gods. They've swapped sides this time, but you get a slightly different interpretation of them here. So you've got Apollo, who is this shredded man, totally well put together, armored. He's got the bow and arrow, a symbol of the phallus ejaculating, targeting particular things and going after them. He's a huntsman. And on the right-hand side, here, the depiction of Dionysus is a little bit more sinister, perhaps you could say, but it still captures that excess, that intensity. He's drunk, he's covered in, well, you can't see if that's blood or if that's wine on his chest. He's supported by these goblins or minions or these types of creatures. But both of these figures show up again and again in our thinking, in our art, in ourselves. Here's a little table. I've mentioned some of the characteristics already, but so you've got Apollo. He's associated with reason, rationality, form and identity, so structures, beauty and purity. There's something about sculptured images that are particularly associated with him. Figures cut out that stand and make an impression. Like I said, he's associated with individuality too, whereas Dionysus is the impulse, the intense emotion, the eruption, the energy, the wildness, the animalism. Dionysus's festivals, if you read ancient literature, have naked women running around the hills, tearing men and tearing animals to shreds and tearing their hair. And he's associated with music, which as the art form is the most abstract in a sense, unlike any of the other arts which work visually, which are about something static. Even if it's cinema, it's like it's a thing that is carved out of our time for our attention, whereas music is just playing with the sounds of being itself, you might say. And there's something in Dionysus that is about this original ontological unity. So where Apollo, as the god of purity and form, necessarily says yes and no to things. He draws boundaries that let things in and let things out. Dionysus dissolves the boundaries. Everything goes in Dionysus's space. If you start Googling around Dionysus and Apollo, you find some funny things. So I came across this meme from the internet about no-fappers versus kumas, right? And it maps kind of nicely, but with like an amusing twinge on it, to this Apollo Dionysus dialectic. So the no-fapper, he's man-made god. He's made it. He's shredded. If you don't know no-fap, it's this kind of, I think it's basically an online cult of guys trying to not masturbate. And they basically think you get superpowers if you don't masturbate. But notice here, it's even said he's ascended physical form completely. He doesn't have a dick. It's almost like he's transcended sexuality. He doesn't even need to engage in these crazy lusts and longings for others. He's pure sculpted beauty. And on the other hand, we've got this primordial Kuma, who is grossly misshapen by the fact that he's just always wanking. All he does is indulge in masturbation, in sensuality. God considers his existence a personal insult, and so on and so on. Now, I think what comes across here is that whoever's made this is sympathetic to the no-fapper side, who sees that like the no-fapper or the Apollonian ideal is the highest achievement of masculinity, whereas the Kuma is some kind of degraded, decadent thing. But I think there's something in both of them. And like I said, the ultimate fantasy of this Apollonian no-fapper is to lack a dick, to just be without sexuality entirely. So that's kind of interesting to bear in mind. Now, as we move forward, we can think about how some of these figures in contemporary pop culture lie onto this Apollo Dionysus split that we're talking about. So James Bond is probably the best modern archetype of the Apollo figure. He's trimmed, he's clean, he's deadly, he's masculine, he's got a gun, which is basically our version of the bow and arrow. He's phallic. But then something like the rock stars, you've got a picture of Guns N' Roses back in their heyday on the right-hand side. They're drunk, they're rowdy, they're boisterous, they're disruptive, but they've got their own kind of brilliant masculine artistic energy. So here's a quote from Paglia. In the West, Apollo and Dionysus strive for victory. Apollo makes the boundary lines that are civilization, but that lead to convention, constraint, and oppression. Dionysus is energy unbound, mad, callous, destructive, wasteful. Apollo is law, history, tradition, the dignity and safety of custom and form. Dionysus is the new, exhilarating but rude, sweeping all away to begin again. Apollo is a tyrant. Dionysus is a vandal. So in Camille Paglia's thinking, one of the things she really wants to attack is the Rousseauian idea of nature, of man. The Rousseauian idea is that man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. Originally, we were part of this beautiful natural paradise where everything worked. And unfortunately, civilization has just come along and oppressed us and forced us to work. And there's a longing back to this primordial beauty. And it's expressed in a lot of our fantasies. You know, this idea of nature. Look at this image. This is undeniably a beautiful depiction of nature. But there's another side to nature too, right? There's the absolute fucking brutality of it. We've got some images here of some puppies shredding a pig, some birds sticking their head inside the eye socket of a dead seal, a deer that's fallen between two rocks and is literally wasted away, a seagull eating, I think that's another baby bird. Nature, as much as it is beautiful sunsets and sunrises and lakes reflecting the clouds, is life tearing other forms of life to shreds. And this actually is connected with the figure of Dionysus, the mythology of Dionysus. He's a god who is born and then torn to pieces. That's one of the key things in the ancient stories about him. So there's something in this figure of Dionysus that encapsulates this, actually, the brutality of nature. where the beautiful form of it that we've got in the background is much more of an Apollonian dream. It's perfect, too perfect, although amazing to gaze upon, amazing to fantasize about. There's a great passage in Paglia's book, Sexual Personae, about apples, and how about really it's an illusion of our eye that an apple is this beautiful, delicious looking thing. Yes, it has that form for a moment in its life, but apples, they grow out of twigs and then they have their form and then they rot and they turn into this slushy brown mess. They're constantly in flux, going from form to other form. But of course, what can we do with art? Art, we can capture that particular moment of the apple, whether it's a beautiful moment or if it's an ugly moment. Here on the right-hand side, we've obviously got a beautiful moment, and we can eternalize it. We can make it something to gaze on forever. So this comes to Paglia's theory of beauty and art. Beauty is our weapon against nature. By it, we make objects, giving them limit, symmetry, proportion. Beauty halts and freezes the melting flux of nature. Interesting, of course, she also mentions how science is also connected with this Apollonian drive. It's a product of the Apollonian mind. Its hope is that by naming and classification, by the cold light of intellect, archaic night, all of the chaos and the craziness and the brutality of nature can be pushed back and defeated. The artist and the scientist, in some sense, they have similar endeavors, although they're working with different means. The artist is capturing a moment of the thing, capturing a beautiful moment of the thing, whereas science is seeking to name and classify, to fix its functioning, to understand precisely how it works, and thus conquer it. So what about men and women? Well, men are far more able to come close, you might say, to this Apollonian ideal of fixed, sculptured existence in the world. Whereas women, their bodies change. They have a menstrual cycle. They have hormonal cycles. Their breasts grow and shrink. They bleed. And also their body is a lot more, there's a lot higher percentage of water in a female body than there is in a masculine body on average. There's something Paglia emphasizes again and again, much more in tune with nature and its cycles, with both its beauty and its brutality in the feminine experience, in the female body, than there is in the masculine body. And of course, we've got stuff like periods and pregnancies, which remind us of this. They're brutal in a sense. And Paglia's got this great point where she's talking about, what would you say, like scatological humor. She's like, we make jokes about piss, like piss off, I'll piss on you, whatever. We make jokes about farting and shits. You're a shit. If someone farts in a public space, it's kind of funny as much as it's gross. We don't make jokes really about periods. There's something about this biological function, about blood coming out of a woman's vagina, that is so gross, uncanny, that we'd prefer to not think about it at all. And it's a continual battle for women to actually get access to the sanitary products they need to actually like contain this thing in many parts of the world, right? It's an ongoing struggle that women face to do with what the fuck do I do about the fact that I bleed. So let's look at some figures of the Western art tradition. Paglia starts her analysis in Sexual Personae by looking at this figure, the Venus of Willendorf, which is tens of thousands of years old. It was found from an old archaeological site. I can't remember where. I think somewhere in the ancient Middle East. She says, look at this depiction of femininity, which is possibly the earliest depiction of femininity we have in art, is emphasizing above all this bulging nature of the feminine, the bloated, watery sagginess of the breasts and the belly and the thighs, so much so that she doesn't even have a face. She's all this body. In a sense, this depiction reminds me a lot of that bulging, moldy apple. It's the excess of nature. It's the indulgence of nature. And then she sets up against this bust of the Queen Nefertiti from one of the Egyptian kingdoms, which is, again, another of our earliest depictions of femininity in art. But it's totally different, right? To the extent that the bust of Nefertiti is all face, head, and neck. The body is removed. All of that femininity that is associated with the natural cycles of things has been totally eviscerated by the artist. We're just left with her face, which has been turned into this angular, clean cut, sharp thing. It's the birth of glamour, which is, there's something harsh about glamour. It's beautiful, but there's also something terrifying about it. Look at the artificially long neck, the kind of the peaceful but still intense stare, the sharpness of the crown, and so on. And actually, I've added these apple figures here as well, because I think they help us to emphasize. So the left-hand depiction is an artist's impression of woman in her natural form, whereas the right-hand impression is woman plus art. It's woman plus fashion, woman plus makeup, woman plus the sexual male gaze that wants to turn her into something beautiful to appreciate. And this is still evident in the fashion industry today, right? Look at these skinny models with sharp cut faces. Often the fashion industry now comes under criticism for being brutal, for pushing people to their limits, for encouraging unhealthy stereotypes about body, unhealthy body images, etc., etc. They don't get that this is precisely the point, according to Paglia. Fashion is about celebrating this artistic triumph over nature. It's about this kind of brutality, in a sense. It's about masculine fashion designers triumphing over the feminine body. Let's now look at some figures from Renaissance art that Paglia spends a lot of time analyzing as well. So the first thing she draws our attention to here, this is a kind of an archetype of depiction of masculinity, popular from at least the Greek times onwards. It's this clean-shaven, trimmed, muscular, but not over-muscular, clean hair, gentle gaze. So we've got three sculptures, and then what I've got at the bottom here is actually a character from a movie called Satyricon by Federico Fellini, which is trying to evoke this character, but with a modern actor as opposed to a sculpture. And Paglia says, look, so this is expressing the Apollonian ideal in a sense. This is pure. It's so beautiful. It's a masculinity, but it's not over aggressive. It's clean. But then there's also an element, if you go a little bit deeper, there is a slight eroticism to it. Like if you look at the way that the guy on the left, that's David, I believe, is standing on with his weight over to one side. It's a little bit coquettish. It's a little bit feminine. It's the same thing in the depiction. I think that's Apollo on the right-hand side. He's got his weight slightly to one side. His gesture is slightly floating, slightly flowing. And it's core to Paglia's understanding of great art that there will always be this kind of tension between Apollo and Dionysus within it. So we've got this attempt to create a beautiful Apollonian sculpture, triumphing over nature, sex, and all of its brutality. But we still end up, the artist can't resist having this slightly over-erotic, you might say, relationship with his subject. He enjoys the process. He enjoys gazing upon it. Another depiction we have here, here's two icons of Hercules. Now in the left, we've got a very, very masculine Hercules, totally shredded. battling with a snake, quite commonly analyzed in terms of this battle between order and chaos. But on the right hand side, we've got Hercules again. The snake's gone, but it's almost like the snake's turned up inside of him. Now he's got the feminine posture. He's standing over to one side, slightly snake-like with his hips, slightly camp. It's almost like you can't escape that, whatever it is that that snake is symbolizing, that the Apollonian Hercules is trying so desperately to conquer on the left-hand side. The moment it's gone, it returns inside of him. And if you compare, for example, there's that little sculpture on the side in the middle of someone with a thing over his head. It's like, that is by nowhere near as interesting as these other two depictions. There's not, it's kind of clean, but it's not got that tension in it that both of these depictions hold, that Apollo versus Dionysus. Here's another depiction from Renaissance sculpture. I think this is Donatello's David, if I remember. It's a guy, but again, look how effeminate it is. It's got that hip flex. His chest, it's almost like they're little boobs. His dick is tiny. His body's very round. He's got long hair. He almost looks like a guy you might see in a fetish club holding a whip. And even here, and this is, I think, one of Paglia's most interesting analyses. So this is a depiction of one of the Medici brothers, I think Giuliano da Vinci, by one of the great sculptors, which perhaps initially looks like it's trying to just be very masculine, very Apollonian, cut out, muscular. But then look, it's got that slightly elongated neck, just like Nefertiti, that erotic extension of the neck. The nipples are a bit large. They're almost like female nipples on this masculine body. And the breastplate itself, which presumably holds his cape, it's like, what is that attached to? It's almost like he's pierced his own chest with it. It's hanging on him by its own weight with something digging in. So Paglia is saying, look, even in this very masculine depiction, the artist can't resist bringing in a little bit of kinkiness, you might say, a little bit of femininity, a little bit of blurring the boundaries between what you're looking at. It's like masculine, but it's also got something else. I remember, as we were just talking about at the start, just a reminder, so Apollo is this shredded, totally formalized, structured, beautiful, pure thing, sculptured. And then Dionysus is this intoxication, this blurredness, this impulse, excess. And again, this, I can't remember why I put these slides in again, actually. So I will move on to the next one. Here is what you might see as the contemporary equivalent of sculpture. These men who go to crazy lengths to masculinize their body, to emphasize their muscles. As Paglia says, modern bodybuilding is ritual, religion, sport, art, and science, awash in Western chemistry and mathematics. Defying nature, it surpasses it. And what's one of the things that is often told about bodybuilders? Well, they do testosterone, and testosterone sometimes destroys your testosterone level. It destroys your natural testosterone levels. There's almost like a sacrificing of the body's innate sexuality in order to achieve that state, which is kind of fascinating. This is why I put this in, actually, because look, the Apollonian no-fap fantasy is to ascend physical form. Lacking a dick doesn't even need it. So that's kind of there, I think, in this bodybuilding fantasy. And yet, and here's the funny thing, he winds up looking a bit like this primordial Kuma with this bulging, veiny arm with excess, a kind of monstrous excess. So it's like, the closer you try and get to your Apollonian ideal, the Dionysian will always rear its head again. Here's another interesting quote from Paglia to just wrap up that section, I think. The artist makes art not to save mankind, but to save himself. Every benevolent comment by an artist is a fog to cover his tracks. the bloody trail of his assault against reality and others. So this gets to the core of what you think an artist, as opposed to someone doing decoration, for example, is doing. He's making something to save himself. He's trying to understand his own inner battles between Apollo and Dionysus, his own struggle between his desires to conquer nature and his necessary immersion in nature. And so that, if we think back to those Renaissance sculptures, it's like the artist can't resist bringing the erotic battle into the sculpture. If you learn to see in that way, then you see in the figures of great art, I think. And I think this is true. The more I've thought about Paglia, the more I see it in the great canons. There's always this slight tension in things. It's not quite what it seems. And the artist is trying to work something out for himself. This is true in myself as well, to the degree, I guess, that I can call myself an artist. It's like so much of the drive is driven to get something out, and it's not really to do it for anybody else. It's not to make the world a more beautiful place or a better place. It's almost just like this thing is the only thing that's going to enable me to keep going, this expression, this idea, this obsession. And this is, if any of you saw the talk I gave, well, rather the discussion a few weeks ago about the Dark Renaissance critique of the Game B communities, this was one of the points I think I was trying to make. They were saying that we need to create beautiful art to communicate our philosophical idea. It's like, no, you're wrong. Art isn't about communicating someone's idea, creating a beautiful system. Art is a kind of tragic endeavor, an artist exploring a tension in his heart. And to the degree to which he succeeds is the degree to which he manages to represent that tension, that struggle, in a way that other people look at it and feel it themselves. Oh yes, and one more thought. Look at how Christ is often depicted on the cross. I was thinking about this. So we've got, on the left hand, it's a Renaissance crucifixion. On the right hand, it's an Orthodox crucifixion. And then the top one is just some stock image from Google. And the thing is, I think, to notice is that the right hand, the top right hand one, this muscular, masculine Christ, is never how Christ is depicted. It's not really an interesting Christ, this big bloke. The much more interesting depiction of Christ is this slightly effeminate, suffering figure. I mean, you even see on the left-hand one, the two thieves either side of him. They're both suffering, but they're almost kind of posing as well. If their faces were different, they could be Playboy models, for example. And on the right-hand side, look, his hips go in at the waist and then go out again. It's almost like he's got that feminine hourglass physique. There's something erotic, I think, in great famous depictions of this crucifixion scene that so often are ignored or overlooked. So let's move a little bit onwards to popular culture. As Paglia says, popular culture is the new Babylon into which so much art and intellect now flow. It's our imperial sex theater, supreme temple of the Western eye. We live in the age of idols. The pagan past, never dead, flames again in our mystic hierarchies of stardom. Well, I couldn't resist doing something, a little riff around BDSM and the sex culture that's popped up and that's always been around, but is going more mainstream at the moment. Her analysis of BDSM is fascinating, really. There's something in it that is a longing for the brutality of nature. Remember those images we saw a while ago of creatures tearing each other apart, of the kind of the torture of being a body in natural form. And that's what shows up again in BDSM play. People whip themselves, they choke themselves, they tie themselves up, often using utensils made out of dead animal skin, out of leather, right? It's all about playing with the savage side of nature that so much of our rational, of our day-to-day life has to repress in order to function. It's like what we do by night is the shadow of what happens at day. In daytime, we go to work, we act polite, we put a suit and a tie on, we smile at each other, we say we're doing fine, we pretend to like each other. And there's all these power games and these sexual dynamics going on underneath that aren't spoken. And it's in places like kink communities where these are explored again. But again, to talk about the dialectics of Apollo and Dionysus, notice, for example, the way that this dominatrix on the right hand side, the corset, is all about emphasizing the figure. It becomes very Apollonian again. So even in this place where we're going into the savageness of nature, we're going in this Dionysian space, we use Apollonian sculpting of the body to emphasize things. Some other areas of contemporary culture that Paglia is interested in. As I said at the start, she loves Madonna. She thinks Madonna is an artistic genius who basically in the late 20th century totally tapped into a type of femininity, a type of feminism that academic feminism could not understand at all. Madonna embraces her femininity. She embraces her glamour, her curves, her body. At the same time, sculpting it, like she's wearing a bit of a corset there, but she's also emphasizing herself. And similarly with these Real Housewives, and Paglia constantly goes on about the Real Housewives. She's like, I love it. I love how you see female dynamics playing out between these women. It's not a masculine space there at all, but these are wealthy women who make shit happen in their lives, and they dress themselves up and they look glamorous. Out with the stereotypes, feminism complains. But stereotypes are the West's stunning sexual personae, the vehicles of art's assault against nature. The moment there is imagination, there is myth. So this is where, for example, Paglia pisses off a lot of the academic institutional feminists who are saying, women have been oppressed by male stereotypes of them. They need to liberate themselves and just allow themselves to be whatever they are, whether that's hairy or fat or whatever. Paglia is like, no, beauty, glamour is woman's power. Don't go away from that. Her ability to play with different personas, with makeup, with clothes, is how she does her thing. That's inherently her. And I mean, if you spend time around women, like a lot of them, they love looking at clothes. My girlfriend can easily spend 2 hours, 3 hours in an evening looking at clothes, buying clothes, having them come the next day, sending them back because she doesn't like them. There's this constant play with persona, with expression of self. And it's like, oh my God, I'm going out at the weekend. Okay, what am I going to wear? I need a new outfit, and so on. What does she say about Madonna? Madonna has a far profounder vision of sex than do the feminists. She sees both the animality and the artifice, changing her costume style and hair color every month. Madonna embodies the eternal values of beauty and pleasure. Feminism says no more masks. Madonna says we are nothing but masks. Through her enormous impact on young women around the world, Madonna is the future of feminism. Now, here's an interesting point, because remember at the very start of the MMA, we were talking about Marshall McLuhan, his ideas of visual space, space created by visual media, like writing in particular, versus acoustic space, which is space shaped by the ear, by multisensuousness. Paglia was a student of McLuhan's, by the way, back in the, I think, what, the 50s or 60s or so. Today, we're in an environment, as we spoke about before, that is multimedia, multisensory. We're being bombarded by sound and different screens with different things happening all the time. And like then we were thinking, is our environment more visual or is it more acoustic? We might say now, is our environment more Apollonian or is it more Dionysian? I think the answer to that is that it's much more Dionysian. Dionysus, remember we were saying, is the god of motion and sound as opposed to the Apollonian fixed. Nothing feels fixed anymore. And that's even true in the level of politics and the media and everything. We're in total flux. Everything is moving. It's this, Dionysian space we're in. Again, that emphasizes that. So as we're drawing towards the end here, we've got a few more slides. I want to add on a little bit about perhaps kind of pushing Paglia a little bit further. So one of the conversations that's happened recently in the intellectual deep web philosophy community was about what if Nietzsche and Paglia have kind of got it right with Apollo and Dionysus, but missed something, that there's different faces to Dionysus, and that actually maybe there's a different god we could use to describe what we might say is the totally disordered, messy side of Dionysus. And so the figure of Cybele was brought in, who is the great mother goddess in Western religion. This idea actually came, funnily enough, I think, from the works of Alexander Dugin, who analyzes cultures in terms of Apollo, Dionysus, and Cybele. I don't know if anyone's actually gone through and read all of his stuff. A lot of it I don't think is in translation, but we picked up on that notion of Cybele and ran with it. And so where you've got Apollo as the sculpted, pure, perfect form, and then Dionysus would be the ecstatic rock and roll nightclub, and Cybele would be more the self-destructive addiction, the total just mess that happens, the Alexander Bard might say, the dependence on the tit. And because that's what can happen to people who are in this Dionysian space a lot, right? A lot of rock stars battle drug addictions. A lot of people in the kind of underground party scenes today, it's like, to what degree are they Dionysian rock stars doing drugs and having loads of sex and having a like great crazy time, versus miserable people with deep mental health problems kind of literally disintegrating and eroding themselves. And here we've got Carly on the right hand side, who just, again, so she perhaps corresponds to this great mother, to this Cybele, and again, she's brutal and she tears men to shreds, right? We've got that image of being torn to pieces, the brutality of nature. Again, it's like Dionysus is the energy perhaps that can be harnessed, the energy of nature beyond civilization that can be skillfully harnessed, whereas Cybele is the energy of nature when civilization fails and we're just swamped by floods or by diseases or by our own unconscious impulses that we can't restrain. And so here there's a little timeline that someone I got from Google Images, thinking about a history between Apollonian ages and Dionysian ages. Now, I would actually say, I think this is wrong, but it would be interesting to put in a third axis. I don't know how you do that with Cybelian, because so, for example, they're viewing the modern age as Dionysian. I think Paglia might say that the 1960s was very Dionysian. So if you think about the 50s culture after the war, which was very normative, the pictures of that time, there's a lot of people wearing suits. It was a time when the stock market was great. It was a great time to be a straight in America, in a sense. It was a great time to own stocks and to own homes. And then the 60s became all about rebellion, growing your hair, doing psychedelics, having sex, having this ecstatic lifestyle. But where we seem to have ended up today is that, like, a lot of the glamour and the power and the liberation of the 60s is gone. The liberation movements today are increasingly bitchy and about victimhood. They're increasingly about not this is my power unleashed, but civilization is taking my power away from me. As if something needs to come and save them, as if the great mother needs to come and give that tit and make everything nice again. So here was a YouTube video that I thought I was going to play, but actually I think we're running a little bit low on time, so I'll skip that, but I'll put that in the chat afterwards if anyone wants to watch it. So a few thoughts on where we're at the moment that I've put down, building on what I've spoken about so far. So we're at a point where the traditional identities or the traditional personae have been eroded for whatever reasons in favor of a kind of murky androgyny in culture. And now, as Paglia was saying, these traditional identities or personae are largely Apollonian images, which fix the crazy chaos of nature into place and make some kind of civilization temporarily possible. So like the poles of masculine and feminine, we don't really know where we're at with those anymore. And that's why there are movements like this one, actually, like Manifesto, like the men's movement, and like the women's movement, emerging to really think about this stuff. So masculine men have been told to be more soft. Women have tried to become more masculine, to have career paths. The androgynous has become less about this ecstatic Dionysian way of being and more about victimhood and oppression, as I was just saying. And I kind of think about that androgyny is increasingly not playing skillfully and sexily, if that's a word, with the Apollonian artful poles, but just creating something murky and unattractive. So look, on the top hand side, we've got Axl Rose in his heyday, Michael Jackson, both of them simultaneously more masculine than you and more feminine than you at the same time, versus this person at the bottom, who is just a bit like, cool, bro, cool, sis, yeah. I know I'm being perhaps a little bit, I'm emphasizing the point a little bit here. Not everybody looks glamorous, but so be it. I love RuPaul as well. I think what he is doing with drag is actually brilliant. Like, it's not this murky androgynous thing at all. Drag is about, historically and to today, men playing with feminine stereotypes. And if you watch it, and I mean, I think I should set that as homework really, go watch an episode of RuPaul's Drag Race. It really shows how sexual personae can be played with in a very powerful way. And also exposing that it's not really about these like fixed essentials of being masculine and feminine, but the fluidity and the different forms of expression that can come from wearing different makeups, from wearing different outfits, from wearing different personae. I think that basically, as I started with, Apollo and Dionysus should be kept in a conversation. They should be kept in a tension, the tension that has structured art throughout the ages. Without Dionysus, we end up with this perfectionism, with the Apollonian drive to purity and order gone mad. So these no-fap cults of people desperately trying to remove their sexuality. Fascism, which is largely men getting together and being like, we're going to destroy decadence and make everything how it's supposed to be. Misery's a perfect being. Whereas without Apollo, we end up, as I said, with just addiction, with a mess, with there's no beauty, there's no glamour, there's just hangovers and throwing up in the toilet and so on. And now I've got a few more thoughts at the end that is really, now we're just going into like speculative space, but this is an idea I've been playing with a little bit recently about like what happened to Apollo and Dionysus in terms of religion. So if you actually look into the figure of Dionysus, there's a strange amount of correspondences between Dionysus and Christ as he's told in mythology. So here's just a few of them. Born of a virgin on December the 25th, supposedly. Known as a savior, turns water into wine. He's killed, he's torn to pieces, not crucified, but he's resurrected after 3 days. There's other scenes like he rides into town on the back of a donkey. And as we know, so the Roman Empire went Christian around about 400 AD, I think. So my wondering, and this is deeply poetic speculation, is that the Roman Empire, which was very Apollonian, it was structure and power and force, took this Dionysus figure, or rather the Christian cult took Dionysus and no-fapped him, you might say. They took the excess out of Dionysus and turned him into this slightly Apollonian figure, and then built a religion around Apollonian morality and pushed away the more extreme and ecstatic parts of Dionysus, which then turns, rather than the battle between Apollo and Dionysus, into the battle between good and evil, or God and the devil. As like one of the depictions of Dionysus at the start looks like that devil figure, actually. And the devil is often associated with excess, indulgence, and desire, which in Christian morality is always seen as temptation and sin, versus just the alternative pole to Apollonian order. But where does that energy return? Well, in heavy metal and horror movies and in the occultism, in BDSM and so forth. Western culture has bubbling beneath the surface this thing that has been perhaps denied, this intensity, this Dionysianism that's been associated with the devil. And it's not just in the 20th century. Occultism is old. Heavy metal, you could perhaps trace back to Romanticism. Horror movies, there's been horror literature and Gothic literature and tales like the Marquis de Sade exploring brutal sexuality for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so just to wrap up, here's another quote from Paglia. If you live in rock and roll, as I do, you see the reality of sex, of male lust and women being aroused by male lust. It attracts women. It doesn't repel them. And that is where we shall end for today, guys.